It's my pleasure to welcome Ebony Duncan Shippy, an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Washington University in St. Louis. She examines the impacts of race and racism on education reform policy, school community relationships, and the schooling experiences of marginalized youth in the United States. Her current work examines the implications of charter schools and school choice for racial disparities in education and the social correlates and determinants of school closures in predominantly African American communities. It is very much our pleasure to welcome Ebony to talk about her work with qualitative data in AtlasTi.
Mhm. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jennifer, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm so excited to be here to talk about data. I do love data, and I could talk about data all day, but we are going to discuss one way to carry out a qualitative coding study in AtlasTi. So we're going to talk about content analysis, which is a research method for collecting and analyzing words and other data. And the reason why we'll talk about kind of content analysis is because words matter. Um, Words both shape and reflect our reality. And as a sociologist, I'm interested in what those words suggest about our society and about patterns in our society. And so today, you can, if you were interested in kind of applying some of these tools or some of the kind of specific tools in AtlasTi, there are a lot of resources for doing that online and through our library and other libraries. But it's important if you're kind of going to develop a rigorous study to walk through the steps of how to get there. So today I'm going to kind of talk about what you need to know to produce a strong study using or applying qualitative coding in AtlasTi. So we will, I'll provide a background on the method and then walk through a sample study or an example study, excuse me, before kind of opening for Q&A. Okay. So content analysis, this is a research method for collecting and analyzing words, symbols, and images from text and other media. So and for my purposes at least, it provides a process for understanding something about the nature of society. Okay, so you through content analysis, you're kind of processing and interpreting your data through applying a coding scheme. So there is a wide range of application. You can use content analysis to understand the purpose, meaning, or effects of a text, to make inferences about the author or consumers or readers of that text. You might want to think about the character, quality, or meaning of something, or use algorithms to mine data, kind of large data sets of words. You might want to find correlations or patterns, or use it to understand the intentions of an individual or how a policy decision is made. You might identify biases in communication or even propaganda, or analyze other consequences of communication. Okay, so this might be the flow of information, how that information is presented, or audience responses. And because the applications are so wide, there is a range of data sources that you can use. So pretty much any written text, it might be books, newspapers, magazines, comments on social media or other social media posts, web content, photographs, film, documents, music, and other media. Okay. So because this is not considered a methodology, there are both qualitative and quantitative types of content analysis. So, here our standard distinction between qualitative and quantitative applies. If we're thinking about qualitative content analysis, then this is about interpreting and understanding. So we're looking for meaning here. And if it's about quantitative content analysis, then we're thinking about counting and measuring. So we are transforming the text, or I should say reducing the text to numerical data that can be ranked or measured or somehow assessed through statistical approaches. So you want to make generalizations. Okay. There are kind of, even within quantitative and qualitative, there are other types. So we might have rhetorical content analysis, or rhetorical analysis, which focuses on how something is said or emphasizes how something is said as opposed to what is said. There's semiotic, which focuses on the deep or latent meanings. We often achieve semiotic, or we also execute semiotic analysis through thick description. And then there's also interpretive or conversation analysis. And so there's a whole host of ways that you can carry out this method. And there's so many ways, in part because it's transdisciplinary. So it kind of has a long history in different disciplines and fields. But regardless of the particular approach, ultimately you're looking for patterns around themes and concepts within the text. Okay, so ultimately you're attempting to analyze the text in that manner. In terms of the history in various disciplines, so content analysis has been used in sociology, psychology, other social sciences, communication and journalism, business. It's newer in library and information science, as well as medicine and public health. But marketing, anthropology, cognitive sciences, and others embrace content analysis as a method. In terms of its benefits, you can process a lot of data over a longer period of time. So this can be longitudinal. This is one of the ways that I've applied it, tracking the development of an idea over time through written text. It's unobtrusive, so we are not recruiting people. We're not contacting people. I'm asking them to complete surveys or participate in a lab experiment or participate in an interview. It can be inexpensive depending on what you're analyzing. So for example, if you're analyzing newspaper articles that I did that are accessible through a library database, I did not have to spend any money. However, if you're analyzing social studies textbooks for how the Civil War is represented, then you might have to spend money in that case. Okay. Other benefits, it can be replicable depending on how careful you document your analysis. It can be integrated with other methods because it's considered fairly flexible. It's also pretty straightforward for correcting errors. And as I mentioned already, it's useful for inferring latent content. Now, that being said, it's very time intensive. It can be. And it can be tedious at times. And it involves subjective interpretation, which raises questions around reliability and validity. Okay. So just a couple of misconceptions. So this idea that content analysis is easier than other approaches, particularly more positivist type of approaches, is untrue. It requires, while it's an accessible method, it requires specialized training to both plan and to execute, particularly when it comes to developing the coding scheme, which is central to your analysis. So now let's take a look at the actual stages in the content analysis research process.
You want to pause there and check in with Doris? Have we made it to the point?
Yes, we have
Perfect.
made it to the point.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Ebony. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. No, listen, I do this. My students have many stories. So thank you both for making this very easy. Thank you again, Jennifer, except for inviting me to participate. And I hope that this was fruitful for folks. I know it's probably a little different. Like when I was looking at some of the previous years, it's probably a little different from some of what you all do, but hopefully not too different.
Excited. No, we're excited. We want to grow more in this area so we can support people like you. You know, if you need us, not people like you because you're very sophisticated, but newer people.
I appreciate it, and I still need you all. I love the library. And as I said, this, I cannot imagine what you all had to do to get the remote lab up and running, but thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so
We're
much.
so glad it's useful.
It is. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm using it. My students are using it. It's been very, very helpful. I know we had the outage, well, the license issue, but this has been very, very helpful.
I'll follow up with you about maybe doing a hands-on session. It'll probably have to be small since we'll need people to be able to remote in.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm. That
but
sounds
yeah,
great.
we can give it a run and see, if it
Mm-hmm.
works, and if you're up for it, maybe we'll do more than one.
That sounds good to me, and I'll think about it too, and thinking we'll have to think about how to get folks some data, but I can check in AtlasTi to see what canned data
Yeah,
they
like
have.
sample data sets.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just haven't looked. But sounds good, Jennifer. So thanks so much. Thank you,
Thank you
Doris.
too.
You all have a great
You
afternoon.
You too. Thanks,
Thank
Ebony.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Quantitative research approaches. Okay. Excuse me. There are both qualitative and quantitative approaches to conducting content analysis. Today, of course, I'll focus on the qualitative, but I will note where some of the differences between the two matter. So, if we're thinking about the differences, the key difference between qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative is about interpreting and understanding information. So we're gathering data on the lives of individuals, or we're gathering, in this case, the development data on the development of an idea or development of a cultural practice, or a narrative. So we're kind of gathering this information to interpret and understand, to make some statement about society based on patterns in that information. And then in contrast, if we're thinking about quantitative research, we're counting and measuring. Okay, so we're gathering numerical data, we're ranking, we're categorizing, and we're usually applying some form of statistical analysis, even if it's just at the descriptive level. Okay, so we have kind of these two overarching types of content analysis, but within each, there are various categories. And because this method has been embraced across various discipline and fields, some of the kind of approaches are limited to certain fields. So we might see a rhetorical analysis within, or rhetorical version of content analysis, which is basically less emphasis on the meaning of what is said and more emphasis on how it is said. So this is popular in analyzing speeches, particularly political campaign speeches. We might see semiotic content analysis, which is popular in like literary or cultural studies, where there's a focus on deep latent meanings. We talk about kind of rich or thick description as a form of both, as a form of validity, or kind of validating our study. And then there's kind of interpretive, conversation analysis, and so on. So there's a whole host of ways that you can actually carry out content analysis, which is great because the method is really flexible. But then the trade-off of that is sometimes the kind of standards for rigor are not as clear or consistent as we would like. Okay, but regardless, kind of the bottom line is, regardless of how you decide to categorize or code your data or process your data, you're really kind of still identifying patterns or themes around your concepts. So these patterns or themes within the text, that is the basis of your analysis. Okay. And so I already alluded to this a bit, but the method has a long history in, to say a long transdisciplinary history. So we know that it's used widely in sociology, psychology, journalism, communication, business. It's a bit newer in library and information sciences, medicine, and public health, but it is one of the fastest growing methods in some of our communication fields still. So content analysis is widely applicable. There are various data sources, and it's been embraced by a variety of fields and disciplines. So just in terms of benefits, And this is one way that I've actually used this method. You can track data over time, kind of trace changes in the development of ideas over time, for example. Another benefit is this is an unobtrusive method. So we do not have to recruit people to engage in content analysis. A lot of our data is publicly available. Depending on what you're analyzing, it can be inexpensive. So if you're analyzing newspaper articles like I did, that's generally free through library databases or fairly low cost. But if you're analyzing textbooks, for example, sociology textbooks to understand how the Civil War is discussed, that could be more costly. With good research training, this method can be replicable. I already talked about it being flexible. It can be integrated with other methods to strengthen your study. It's fairly easy to correct errors when you catch them. And then finally, it's useful for inferring latent content, excuse me. That being said, though, it can be very time intensive, and it also involves subjective interpretation, and so it raises questions about reliability and validity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in general, this misconception or this idea that content analysis is kind of easier than other approaches, I think is unfounded. It's an accessible method, but it still requires specialized training, especially to plan. And hopefully kind of by the end of today, you'll have a deeper insight of some of the debates in the methodological literature around content analysis. So you will need specialized training to plan and to execute, as well as to kind of develop the coding scheme and train other members of your research team. I think I have a question. No? Okay, so I will move on. So if you have a question, you could raise your blue hand or ask in the chat. Okay, so let's walk through stages in the research process as they relate to executing content analysis. So with any good project, you want to make sure that you start with a strong research question or strong aim or motivation. So, this is a careful planning is required here. You're thinking about, obviously what you want to measure, or excuse me, what you want to analyze and why. What is your question? What do you want to understand? This is important because your aim is going to, of course, determine every other decision that you make when you're planning or creating your analysis. Okay, so let's just kind of think through. We have our research question. I'm going to give you all a kind of overview, and then we'll walk through a specific example on the next slide. So you have a research question, the who, what, when, where, why you're asking. Now we're ready to move to sampling and thinking about your unit of analysis. So there are just in the case, just similar to the case in other methods, there are a variety of ways that you can sample data for qualitative coding. Now, here again, depending on what you're analyzing, a sample might be necessary because there are too many units or too many cases for you to analyze. So you want to think about a way to still answer your question, still collect data, but do so in a way that is realistic. So you might do purposive sampling, random sampling, stratified or cluster sampling. The goal here is to get to the most precise level, okay? So when you're thinking about your particular case, the thing that you're analyzing or what you want to draw conclusions about, You want to get to the most precise level, okay, of doing that. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So this is where unit of analysis comes in. You might think, okay, so this is very, very straightforward in research. The unit of analysis is important. So remember, the unit of analysis is the element on which data are analyzed and for which findings are reported. So if you have sometimes if you have a quantitative mind, these will be your observations. So these are kind of the elements on which you're making or reporting findings, so your analysis. So these are the individual units that we are describing, explaining, or analyzing, okay? Generally speaking, in social scientific research, the unit of analysis and the unit of observation are the same. Okay, so the unit observation is actually what is being collected. It's the unit of data collection. Okay, so it's if the unit of analysis is the element on which data are analyzed and findings are reported, then the unit of data collection is the element on which each variable is measured. As I said, usually this is not or usually in social sciences, the unit of observation and the unit of analysis are the same. So for example, if we were conducting a study of individuals who attend these types of trainings, both the unit of analysis and the unit of observation or data collection would be the individual. Okay. Now, an example when those would differ would be if, let's say, we were conducting a study and we wanted to understand communication between mothers and their daughters. And so we had mothers keep a diary of conversations, and we had daughters keep a diary of joint conversations, and then we analyzed those. So our units of observation or our units of data collection would be the mothers and then also the daughters. Our unit of analysis, though, would be the dyad, the two together, because we want to understand how they are processing, interpreting, or viewing those conversations, and where there is correspondence and where there's not. Okay, so we want to think about those two together. So our unit of analysis is the mother-daughter dyad, but we're getting our information from both mothers separately and daughters separately. Okay. The kind of important piece here is that regardless of how you collect your, regardless of how you report your data, at least one of those, either the unit of analysis or the unit of observation, or sometimes called the unit of collection, one of those has to be some type of message. Okay. Now here's kind of where we begin to get a little, kind of get into some of the murkiness or the gray area within the methodological literature. So in content analysis, there's no established criteria for the size of the unit of analysis, or the number of cases that you need, or the number of pages of text or transcribed data. So there's not really like a set fixed criteria. Okay. Often what we do is engage in a form of like an informal type of peer review beforehand, but we certainly draw upon pre-existing literature and thinking about those criteria, and then also studying and reviewing published work in our field, just that might not be in our particular area, but just around our disciplinary or field standards for acceptable or established criteria. Because even if there were established criteria in one discipline or one field, it's not necessarily going to translate to another in given what we study. Okay, so let's move to data collection. Okay, so we have our question, we have our aim, the purpose of our research. We have identified our unit of analysis and how we want to sample. Now it's time to collect our data. So it's important here, you want to identify your content. What are you analyzing and why? This is where you'll see, as with all research, it's very important to keep kind of specific notes, like a research log for this type of analysis, and it begins with planning. So for example, if you're at the data collection stage, you're planning your data collection, you're identifying your content, you, based on your question, you say, okay, these type of sources or this type of source will provide the most useful information or provide the widest variation of information or the widest coverage of events, whatever your aim or interest might be, or what's necessary to meet that aim will determine where you collect your data and why. So if you're collecting books, you want to identify books. If you're collecting from a particular publisher in your research log, you're noting why this publisher and not that publisher. Okay, so these are, you're justifying, recording, documenting every decision that you make, because ultimately this is part of or important to your reliability and validity, which we'll come back to again in a few slides. So you want to identify your content, your medium, you know, it's newspapers, website comments, what papers, what websites, what dates and times. You're thinking about the parameters, as I mentioned. So if you were taking newspaper articles from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, let's say we wanted to understand coverage of the 2020 election, and we were taking examples from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So first, you want to determine, for example, parameters like your date range. Are you only focusing on coverage in 2020, like during the actual election year? Are you focusing on coverage from when candidates announced? Is it for all candidates or just the final 2 candidates? So you kind of get, you can see where you had to be very specific and thinking about your parameters for inclusion or exclusion. Similarly, if we're thinking about location with the same example, are we looking at just local elections? Are we looking at the local, state, federal elections and thinking about this coverage? And that matters because then we say, okay, are we only thinking about or analyzing articles that are about St. Louis, that are in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch? Are we also analyzing articles that are about Jefferson City or Kansas City or New York City that are published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch? Okay, so data collection, you have to be intentional and you have to be very clear on what is included and what's excluded. This is ultimately going to be part of your code book, which we'll talk about next. So many of us are familiar with operationalization, which is basically the process of developing measures. So in content analysis, this means that you are constructing a code book or coding scheme. Okay. So a code in qualitative research, a code is a word or short phrase that kind of captures the essence of something. Okay. Codes are, in terms of kind of building a strong code book, they are mutually exclusive and they are exhaustive. So each code in your research, excuse me, each unit in your research or each observation in your research can have one code for a particular concept. So let's say kind of with our example around the 2020 election, one concept that we wanted to understand was bias in coverage. Okay, so bias in coverage is one concept, and gender differences is another. Oh, someone says thank you, Jasmine. So Jasmine shared about the slides. Jasmine, that was not you. I just did not click the highlight. So we are still on the same slide. We are just on number 3, excuse me, number 4, operationalization. Okay. So here we're thinking about kind of a code being mutually exclusive. If we're coding for political bias, so orientation like towards the left or the right, that would be one category. So every unit in our analysis would be it's left leaning or it's right leaning. But then, so it can't be both, but we also want to be exhaustive. So you might say, well, wait, there are some people who are more moderate, some people who are slightly right or slightly left, but that's what you develop in your code book. Okay, so you might have, instead of a binary liberal or conservative categorization, you might have a 5 category variable that you develop. So 5 categories ranging from very conservative to very liberal, and then a neutral or other category, so that you could ensure that all of your units have a code that's mutually exclusive. Okay. Now, when you're doing it, so when you're kind of constructing your code book, and this is before your analysis begins in earnest, or I should say before your final analysis begins. So when you're constructing the code book, the goal is to basically remove differences among individual coders. So the idea is you're producing this document so that someone else other than you can sit down, based on your code book, come to similar conclusions and code in similar ways because of how you describe the concepts in the codes, or the categories in the codes in your text. Okay, so basically you are attempting to replace yourself, but that is how detailed your documentation has to be, even if you are coding alone, not as a team. Trust me, years can go by between when you originally developed the code and when you return to using it again. And so you want to be very specific about the decisions that you made and why, and your inclusion and exclusion criteria. At the end, I'll actually show an example. Oh, I need to move a little faster. I'll actually show an example from one of my code books. Okay. When we're creating these categories, which will hopefully be clear when we talk about the analysis process and the example study, but when we're creating these categories or these conceptual elements that kind of cover our data, we might take both inductive and deductive approaches. So inductive, we're looking at the data, we're kind of developing theories or drawing concepts and themes from the data. Whereas deductive approaches require that we're looking for predetermined patterns. So we might have a theory already, and we are examining our data, our raw data, to understand if they conform with that theory or consistent with that theory or not, or if they expand it in some other way. Okay. So there are different types of coding: open coding, axial coding, and analytical coding. Open coding is really just, it starts when you read a document. You might be developing your code book, you're taking notes, you're jotting down questions, you're just kind of recording your reactions. And at this point in the stage, you're identifying segments of data that might be useful. So you're thinking about your research question, your aim again, and you're identifying segments that might be useful. Axial coding is once you've kind of gone through an iteration or two of reading your documents, you have your coding, you have your list of open codes, but then you begin to notice that some of those codes are related, and so you group them together. And this is considered axial coding. This also is a cyclical process. So remember, we talked about your coding category should be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So as you're kind of developing these codes, you're still checking to make sure that there is not overlap in how you are assigning those codes and defining and assigning those codes. And then finally, there's analytical coding, which is more when we move beyond description to really interpret the meaning, the significance, and the patterns that are in our data. Two final points for operationalization. Content analysis can capture both manifest or latent content. Okay, so manifest content, you look at what the text says, you look at the quotes, and that is what you report, that is what you analyze. You're kind of offering a rich description of the quotes as they are stated and how that relates to other patterns in the text, other documents, and so forth. Latent, however, requires inference about what the text kind of means, what it truly means. Okay, so it's this idea that one thing might be stated. So for example, the way that the term urban is used in the text might suggest a degree of race or racial, might evoke a sense of race or kind of racial inequality, just depending on how it's used. But you are making an inference about what that use means beyond describing, beyond a geographic term that's describing a city, part of a city. Okay. In practice, these the differences between manifest and latent content, or interpreting manifest and latent content, are not so clear cut. And so it's helpful to think of content as being on a continuum between highly manifest and highly latent, as opposed to strictly manifest or strictly latent. Okay. Um, so let's get to data analysis. Now, your data analysis and content analysis is always iterative, and it can be a very, very complex process. But the goal at the end of the day, whether you're taking a quantitative or qualitative approach, you want to make sense of your data and you want to answer your research question. So in doing this, and I think it'll be most helpful to walk through an example when explaining this. So I'll do that on the next in the next set of statements. And so in doing this and kind of making sense of your data, you're engaging in both the inductive and deductive reasoning. You're thinking about your concepts, your description, your interpretation, and you're often filtering through different types of documents and concepts as you're doing this. So you might be in your code book and you say, okay, I'm looking at this political ideology variable. I've applied it to my speeches, or I've applied it to my newspaper articles. And it seems that women in the South are more prone to embracing this type of belief than men in the South are. So let me go through and reanalyze. So this is kind of like an iterative process. If you don't remember anything else from today, the question that you should ask yourself as you're kind of conducting this type of analysis is, how do I know? Okay. So how do I know? How can I support this conclusion? How can I test this observation to see if I'm accurate? And what will be required of reporting this? So how will I know? There are tons of practical tips across different bodies of literature. So one, for example, that I read in Earl Babby, which is a reference that I included at the end of this talk, says to offer 3 different examples to support a finding or conclusion. So 3 different examples from your data. Another is to use different, so to triangulate or use different sources of data. So I mentioned in the kind of political ideology or bias example, that you might be coding political speeches, but then you also might code newspaper articles. You also might code candidates' websites to understand political bias and how they are covered, or so forth. So the ultimate question again is, how do I know? Okay, as I'm kind of processing or moving back and forth between the documents or the texts that I'm analyzing, my research questions, my code book, and then my log. Okay. Actually, let me go. So let me give an example. Actually, for the sake of for time's sake, I'll say the example for Q&A, and I'll walk through reliability and validity quickly, and then computer assisted analysis, and then open for Q&A. Okay. So when we're thinking about reliability and validity, while the definitions, of course, are the same as in other studies, how we go about achieving each is different in a lot of respects. So if we're thinking about what's similar, basically reporting reliability and thinking about your validity is a way to communicate that your study has integrity. So you want, of course, to produce rigorous research. You've checked for intercoder or inter-rater reliability. You've talked about your method for data reduction. You did everything necessary to make sure that your data were good or right or processed well, analyzed thoughtfully and carefully, and in a way that can be replicated. So this is where reliability comes in. If we're thinking about this as the extent to which a measuring procedure yields the same results on repeated trials. So sometimes this is reviewed as replicability. Can you replicate your analysis? Have I done a good enough job constructing my code book that someone else could come in and sit down and code and achieve a reasonably or draw reasonably similar conclusions to what I have drawn, or code in the same way? Okay. So without reliability measures, your content analysis is useless. Okay. We cannot consider without reliability, we cannot consider your study valid. Reliability or high reliability does not ensure a valid study, but it is a necessary condition for it. Okay. So we have, and that's because what reliability does is validate your coding scheme. Okay. You only need 2 people to do this. Come back to that in a moment. So it validates your coding scheme, and you only need 2 people because that demonstrates that more than one person can use the coding scheme or code book, which is a tool. They can use this tool with similar results. Okay. So when we're thinking about kind of 2 coders, you would report intercoder reliability, which is at minimum, which is the amount of agreement or correspondence on a measured variable. You're not, in this case, reporting reliability across variables, across the study. And the reason why is because some variables are less subjective than others. If we were coding a study and we were thinking about, again, with our political bias study, gender might be more straightforward to code than others. If we're thinking about clothing color, the color of a tie, for example, that might be more straightforward to code than, for example, whether or not a candidate is left-leaning or right-leaning on climate change. Okay, so if you were to average your reliability and you had very high or perfect reliability for the categorical or the descriptive categories like gender or clothing color, but then you had a lower one, which is what we would expect on the kind of actual political ideology, the more kind of continuous variable or continuum type of variable. If you have high on one and low on others, now you've averaged it and you can suggest a reliability coefficient that is inaccurate. So what you want to do instead is compute reliability, calculate the reliability for each variable. In practice, we really see key variables. So if you have a study with 27 variables, for example, we generally don't see reported reliability for all 27. But when it comes to reporting, it's always better to err on the side of over-reporting information than under-reporting. Okay. So there are others. So we have, this is intercoder reliability. So 2 people coding the same set or subset of text arrive at similar conclusions. So this is the rate of agreement or correspondence. There's also intra-coder reliability. So how reliable your coding is over time as an individual. And then what we call unitizing reliability, which is when you work with a team to kind of create your coding protocol. So this is a more interactive exchange among team members to say, these are our inclusion criteria and these are our exclusion criteria. Okay. The two most common forms of reliability reported are kind of a general raw percentage agreement and Cohen's kappa. So I'm just noting those for the purposes of additional research if you wanted to conduct more background reading, if you wanted to complete more background reading on the different types. There are I can think of at least 6 different types of reliability assessments, but percent agreement and Cohen's kappa are the most common. Percent agreement is kind of pretty straightforward. It's really just you're calculating when the two raters agree. I should say that more technically. It's a measure of the agreement between two raters who classify items into mutually exclusive categories. So you just take a simple cross tab and you pay attention to where rater 1 and rater 2 are coding similarly or not. And then again, with Cohen's kappa, this is a coefficient that basically calculates agreement or not, but taking into account that there could be some error, okay, or chance. So in general, while there is not, again, one standard cutoff for reliability coefficients, a Cohen's kappa of 0.81 or higher is generally preferable. So it indicates almost perfect agreement. In contrast, a 0.61 to 0.8 Cohen's kappa is substantial agreement. And Tana, just a note, because this is a coefficient, it can range between -1 and +1, similarly to a correlation coefficient, where 0 represents the amount of agreement that can be expected from chance. And while we don't see negative coefficients, in theory, this can happen, which means that you and the other rater never agree, okay, if it's below 0. The key threats to reliability, hopefully would be clear by now, is a poorly designed code book or coding scheme, or insufficient training. So you have to train your coders, okay? You have to train them in how to apply codes, what a codable unit is, how to use the code book, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so forth. Sometimes coders can be fatigued, which is actually another threat from reliability, because coding qualitative data can be very tedious and time-intensive work. And so these can kind of introduce bias or error, kind of poorly designed code books, insufficient training, and coder fatigue. I'll go through validity quickly and then open for questions. Jennifer says, yes, the good code books. It is so important. It's funny when you're doing it at the time and you're alone, it can feel a bit unnecessary, like you're kind of doing, like overdoing it, but it's so important to be specific. It's so important to be specific because again, you can, not only is it critical for having a rigorous study where someone else can replicate or reproduce it, but for yourself, you have to document these decisions so that when you're reporting, you are building your case and you're communicating to reviewers and your audience that you were careful to ensure that your study has integrity and we can trust you. We can trust that you're not selecting documents that represent the findings that you want or the conclusions that you want to draw. We can trust that you're being systematic. We can trust that you are operating ethically. okay? That you're conforming to the research ethics that are standard in our academic endeavor. Okay. I won't, let's see. Whew. Okay, validity. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So do we have good measurement? Internal, in terms of our study, what we can control. Internal validity is your conceptual definitions and operational definitions make sense. They match. This is guided by the literature. This is guided by other experts in the field. This is guided by, if you're on a research team and you're developing the code book, consensus building. External validity has to do with generalizability. For content analysis, this is primarily, again, about the replicability, so good documentation here. If you use a stratified random sample or other type of probability methods to select your data, then you, of course, will improve, or to collect your data, you will improve your generalizability. Um, so in practice, again, if you're thinking about validity in content analysis, remember the replicability piece. But then also it's so validity is harder too, because ideally we would use the same measures across several studies, across a series of studies, kind of to validate the content, but that rarely happens, and that's been a concern over the last 65 years. So basically, with every new content analysis study that we see, even if it's on subjects that have already been examined, we usually see new categories. And that's because people generally take a grounded theory approach or an inductive approach where they're pulling information from the data as opposed to taking a deductive approach and applying or testing a previous theory or set of concepts using those data. Okay. And then finally, even though I spent a good amount of time focusing on operationalization and coding, analysis is more than coding. So in addition to organizing your data, processing your data, visualizing and reporting your data, so we talked about the importance of documentation. It's also, in terms to replicability, it's also important to be organized in naming of files, documents, text, and so forth. It's also important to be organized and to keep your data, if you can, and this is just kind of a practical tip, in one format. When I was conducting, when I did my first or second content analysis study while a graduate student, I did a lot of this by hand. So I was coding in Word, using the comments in Word, which would require me to create unique numbers for each code. This is all by hand, even though I'm still using the computer. Create unique numbers for each code using the Word comments in Word. Then translating those comments to Excel and the article information. I was coding newspaper articles. So the date, article information, paper source, and then the quote, and then taking that and analyzing that in Stata, which is a quantitative analysis software for developing and I was doing that to look at the frequencies, for example. That's a lot of time and effort just to look at frequencies. That wasn't even the heart of the study. Since then, I've learned about AtlasTi. There are other sources, other qualitative data analysis software, but AtlasTi allows you to process large bodies of textual, graphical, audio, and video data. It helps you kind of keep all of your information in one source. So as opposed to kind of moving between different files and moving between different programs to analyze, you have all of your data in one source. It's easier to keep your naming consistent in terms of how you're actually naming your documents and your files, how you're de-identifying files if necessary, for example, and it's less prone to error because you're not kind of switching between these different documents. Or in the old days, when you would conduct qualitative content analysis, you're using highlighters and tabs, and you were kind of having these huge binders, and you're kind of organizing your data in that way. But this is a really intuitive way of thinking about it. In addition to kind of processing your data, visualizing and reporting data are important in your analysis. Here, I just included an image of a concept map in AtlasTi. So let me pull, this is a little bit of an older version. They're a little prettier now. But basically you can identify, so let's say each of these nodes represents a different code. Okay. And the blue categories are kind of your theme. So we might have political ideology, appearance, region. These are each for our political example. So you have organized your different codes into these categories. And as you can see, you're showing the relationships among these categories. Okay, so it's helpful for that. You can look at what we call a co-occurrence table. So let's say in my example, in my research, you had I was interested in looking at the terms that were used for race and how they were used for race. So inductively, I processed data to find different racial terms, and this was looking at manifest content. So I was not looking at latent meaning. And then I also took a deductive approach because previous research suggested that race could be used to describe, it could be used to explain, it could be used to evaluate, or it can be used to prescribe policy. And so I wanted to look at when we use the word desegregation in the text, which is one of the racial terms that I was analyzing, do we see it most often in an evaluative sense, in a prescriptive sense? How is desegregation being talked about? And so I was able to look at the word desegregation and its co-occurrence with descriptions, prescriptions, evaluations, and explanations. Okay. And then finally, and I'll kind of end here, just in terms of thinking of practical tips, careful planning, as in with any research study, careful planning is paramount. You want to be sure to think very critically about what you are trying to do, what question you're trying to answer, and what are different ways of going about doing that. So there are many, many different ways you can look at some of the concepts. People have been really creative in their application of content analysis. But whatever you decide, document carefully, keep careful records, and be sure to report it. You want to share more as opposed to less. So even if you're reporting this in a appendix, you want people to know that you can be trusted. And then remember, there's never a perfect study. There will always be trade-offs between reliability and validity, among other considerations. So if we were thinking about this in content analysis, some recommend analyzing both to address these trade-offs. Some folks recommend analyzing both manifest and latent content. So you're looking at what's said, and you're looking also at, or you're making inferences about what is unsaid. You can use triangulation, where there are multiple investigators, so a team, multiple sources of data. You might, for example, provide what we call rich or thick descriptions. So in this case, this provides the reader with the information necessary to determine whether your study matches, whether the kind of the codes or concepts or findings that you draw in your study are consistent with the concepts that you also describe in your study. And then of course, use computer assisted technology like AtlasTi. And finally, training for your coders. Okay, the more training, the better. I recommend, in the past, I have, for my newspaper study, for example, I have trained coders using newspaper articles from a separate study, or just a set of newspaper articles that were not being used in my study, so that the topics were similar and the content was similar, so we could still use the code book, but there was not actually the risk of somehow biasing my study in the final stages. So as we were kind of piloting the code book, we used articles that were outside of the collected sample. And then when we conducted the full coding, we did another reliability assessment on that final. And that's typically what's reported on that final round of coding. So we're right at 11. I'm sorry. Let me I'll kind of.
If you want, if for people who can stay around and if you have time for questions, I mean, I think we can do that if you're good with doing that.
I am, and I just put my email in the chat. So if you have to run and you have a question, you can email me at duncane@woostel.edu. I dropped that in the chat. I'm happy to answer your questions. I'll be frank, it'll probably be a couple of days over, over email, but I will respond. And then kind of as we're thinking about questions, I have some resources here, which, you know what, I think it would be helpful to drop those in the chat as well. So let me stop the share. Chat. Yeah, I was going to say, Jennifer, there are a few questions about licensing, but it looks like you already saw those. So any questions? I know we covered a lot of ground, fairly technical, but the goal here is to help advance qualitative research, help advance content analysis in a practical sense. So any questions about practice, any questions about other points here? And if it is helpful, if it would be helpful, I can also walk through an example for folks of just different, or an example from my own work. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming. Is it Macy? Okay. Any questions?
Looks like someone's asking for the example.
Oh, someone's okay, sure, Jenny. So let's and I think it'd be helpful to go back to the aim or research question. So I'll share again to see a demonstration in AtlasTi. Yes. So someone also asked, Camilla asked about interpreting correlation coefficients. Yes. So in AtlasTi, you can calculate the Cohen's alpha. And so there is a guide that they have, which I dropped in the chat. There's a section in their guide that says data analysis and theory building tools. And they talk about co-occurrence. They talk about completing, the co-occurrence tables. They talk about that in AtlasTi, along with calculating the, they call it intercoder as opposed to iterator. So that's sometimes the terminology, but intercoder reliability. So the way that you'll, when you kind of have your team, so that's one benefit of AtlasTi. You can have, that's another benefit, I should say. You can have different team members coding in the software program. So when you actually run your, or calculate your intercoder reliability, which AtlasTi does for you, based on kind of how you set up the parameters, you're looking for a 0.8 or above correlation. And the study that I am sharing, my Cohen's alpha, I said alpha. My Cohen's kappa was 0.778. So let me kind of walk through that study and thinking about aim or research question. So I wanted to understand how race was used in charter school discourse. Okay, so in my original planning, we were going to be very interactive, but that would take too much time. So we're thinking about charter school discourse. We can kind of identify different texts or different documents for analyzing that discourse. So it might be the websites of charter schools. We might be thinking about policy, like actual legislation. For this, I'll kind of just walk through my decisions. When I was thinking about it, I was looking at a particular case. It was Cleveland, Ohio. This was a significant case because it was the first city in the state that experimented with charter schools. And so I wanted to understand how this place, as the first city to experiment with charter schools, kind of the racial significance of this intervention there. And so in thinking about this question in Cleveland, so I had my case. It was Cleveland, Ohio. I knew I wanted to think about the development of this idea in Cleveland. I ultimately decided, when I said, how do we look at discourse? I ultimately decided to use newspaper articles. And the reason why I decided to use newspaper articles is because my aim was to understand more about the underlying ideology, okay, of charter school discourse. And I argue that although print readership of newspaper articles was declining, they represent this kind of ideological or cultural archive. Now, the other side of that is, digital readership is increasing and so forth. But the important point is, I was able to make a case about charter schools being, newspapers being its ideological archive. And some reviewers took issue with it. They said you should look at video, you should look at newscasts, like video broadcasts and so forth. But I was able to make the case. Okay, so I have my Medium newspaper articles. Now, the tricky piece is, as you're kind of processing these articles, and you have to decide this beforehand, how will I know what is a charter school article? Okay, so you might say, okay, an article. So your attitude cannot be, okay, it's an article about charter schools. So what does that mean? So what I did before I collected my data for the study was really just begin reading newspaper articles and a separate source about charter schools. Okay. So, and as I'm reading, I'm thinking what about this article lets me know that it is a charter school article? And that, in this case, is distinct, for example, at least in my criteria. So I was not interested in articles that just mentioned charter school names as a list of other names. And I was not interested, for example, in articles that mentioned that someone might work at a charter school, but the article was not necessarily about that school. I was not interested in articles about sporting events. And so I realized this reading other articles about charter schools specifically and schools more generally. And so when I was ready to begin to collect my data, I came up with the inclusion criteria that a charter school article was one that included charter school in the title, the lead paragraph, or at least two other times elsewhere in the article. So again, I excluded obituaries, I excluded sports reports, and I excluded articles that named individuals affiliated with charter schools, or just events that happen to take place at a charter school, like a job fair that took place at a charter school. So I excluded those excluded those articles for my search. It's also important to note, kind of in your case, specifics around terminology. So in Ohio, for example, charter schools are also referred to as community schools. So I had to also search for community schools and include those analyses. So when I was ready to collect my data, I knew that I had a very particular definition of what what a charter school was, and how to determine what a charter school article was. Now, the race piece was a little more straightforward in some ways, because when thinking about how race is used, I said, okay, for a charter school article to use race, there just has to be at least one reference to race. But it's like, okay, so not only are you defining race, but then you're thinking of, other forms. So we have race, racial, races, racism. These are other forms that might be included in the article. But in a similar way, as I was kind of reading, and this was using the data that I had on hand, I took a preliminary approach that was inductive reading through. So I developed a list of all of the kind of race words that I thought I would encounter. And then I would add to that list if I came across other words that were race related in manifest content. So again, I was looking at things like racial desegregation or ethnic studies, things that were kind of clearly related to race, as opposed to more latent content like the use of urban, or when we say the geography, like the west side of town or the north side. So if we were to say North or South City in St. Louis, or West County in St. Louis, those might communicate particular information about the racial makeup for some people, and others it might not. And so that's where the difference between manifest and latent content comes in. So I was focused on manifest content. And then I had certain parameters around the time frame. So I collected all of the articles in this newspaper, in the main newspaper. Well, there's two, in the two newspapers in Cleveland from 1991 to 2013. At the time when the study was being conducted, and 1991 was important as a policy year. So it was the year that the first charter school policy was approved in the United States. And so I started there and moved up. In Cleveland, it wasn't until 1997, or Ohio, I should say, it was 1997. So I wanted to understand if there was anything, or I wanted to understand how charter schools were discussed in relative to race even before they opened in Ohio. So that's why I started with that date. My sample, in many respects, is purposive, because I collected all of the charter school articles in Cleveland, like for a particular case. And then in collecting those articles, so for the data collection, nice to meet you, Bill. Thank you. I used two newspaper databases. So one was Newsbank, which was through a library in the Ohio systems. And then the other was Ethnic News Watch, which is through ProQuest. There's also Dow Jones Factiva, which I always forget the new name. Dow Jones Factiva, ProQuest News, I already said that. There are several, but I used a particular algorithm to find charter school articles. So I'm just kind of walking through the details so you can see how specific you have to be. So these were just based on the logical operators within the search options within the databases. And so I searched for charter or community school articles where the word charter was within 2 words of school, because sometimes you might have like charter. You might have like Jefferson High School, or you might have Jefferson Charter High School. So if you were to search just for charter school or charter schools together next to one another, you would miss some of the articles. Okay. So initially, this returned about 1,800 articles. As I said before, with my inclusion and exclusion criteria, I went through and I read the articles for the mention of charter school in the title, the lead, or 2 other times. And then I read through for race as well and decided which articles met my inclusion or exclusion criteria. And then I began to apply my codes, okay? Or I began to develop my code. So remember, in my study, I had both an inductive and a deductive approach to coding. So in terms of the deductive side, I had a theory. I wanted to understand if race was being used in the particular ways that the theory described. So was race used to describe, explain, evaluate, and predict? But I also took an inductive approach. So I, for example, as I was kind of reading through, even just for that part, the deductive part of things, I found that there were a series of racial references that did not fit into one of those 4 categories. And so initially, I coded them as other. And then I went back through, and this is why AtlasTi is awesome. You can say, show me all of the quotes that I coded as other for this concept. And it pulls it up, and then you can begin to kind of cycle through or look through those quotes and say, okay, where am I seeing patterns here? What is happening? You might want to look at the co-occurrence of those codes with others. So again, you kind of begin to say, what does other mean? How many other what categories or what patterns am I seeing within the category of other? And ultimately, I still have an other for 3 out of, I think it's like 500 observations, 500 racial references. So I still have an other for 3, but many were in 2 categories. So race might be used as a part of a name. So for example, the Organization of Black Engineers or the NAACP. So race might be used in that way. And it also could be used as what I was calling a racial condition, which was a special version of another type of reference from the theory that I was applying. So that was the deductive approach. But in terms of the inductive approach, for example, I found as I was reading through articles, there were words that were race related that I did not anticipate reading about. So for example, colored, which is not a term that we use anymore. Colored was included in one of the articles, and this was well, for my time period, this was still 1991 and 2013. So colored was used. It was an op-ed, but colored was used. I was not thinking about names at the time. Court cases. So Brown v. Board of Education, I coded that as a race-related term. So that was about school desegregation. But this is not something that I was thinking about beforehand. So when you are kind of going through these iterations, as I said, this is a very iterative process. You're reading through all your content. If you were to start, you would start with your first document, and you would conduct what's called open coding. This is to begin to develop your code book, and you're reading your document, you're reading your text, you're noting what's interesting, you're recording your reactions. This is kind of the beginning of your analysis. While it's not the formal part that you will report, it's an iteration that you will report. So when I did this study initially, I went through like 10 iterations for the charter school and race study. So first, the first 1 or 2 were about establishing my code book, okay, or developing my code book. I went through and coded the data myself, excuse me. I did an iteration with the coder that I trained where we coded a randomly selected subsample to calculate the final iterator reliability. When I would notice a particular pattern or have a question, I would note that, finish kind of going through my initial iteration of coding, and then start again and go through with just that particular question. So there are a lot of different ways to process the data and to actually sit down and apply codes. But again, this is where recording what you're doing is important. So we kind of talked about this. I touched upon this briefly. I highly recommend that you have a research log. Do I have a log that I can pull up quickly? Actually, before I pull up a log, I'll have the code book that I'll share. Okay, so I'm going to show you all, I'm going to share my screen and show 2 documents. One is my personal research log, and the other is the code book. Okay. So can you all see a Word document?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So here you'll just see I have what the project is for. So this is a revise and resubmit in a journal ed policy. I have the data that I use. So this is the original data by hand. This is the AtlasTi project. And then I had kind of what I did or what I need to do based on what I did. So one of the things I wanted to do was expand code to sentence level, remove duplicates or remove names. There were some coding categories like youth, kids, students that I wanted to combine. And you kind of see other things here. Sometimes it's just as simple as where I stopped coding, what I saved it as. Sometimes it might be, you need to, so I might have had a note which I recorded in AtlasTi, and it says, okay, you need to search for different forms of discrimination. Discriminatory was there. So you can kind of get a sense. And then let me just show you how specific, and code books can be even more specific than this. Let me zoom in. So this is the code book. And then this is just the key here. So you'll see I have the code, which is the name of the code, the brief description above that, the full definition. I have here linked with the
Ebony,
literature.
we're not seeing what you're talking about. We're still seeing your date that you stopped,
Oh,
where you stopped coding.
thank you. Let's see. Okay, so now you see kind of key using this code book.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for letting me know. And then I have, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So let's just look at an example. So I have here danger. So a reference to the area surrounding the charter school is perceived as dangerous. I define what that means, high rates of violence, drug or gang activity. And so when I'm training a coder and when they're applying this, they're looking for violence, drug or gang activity. Here for exclusion criteria, I put do not apply this code to references to safety in the school or on the school grounds. There was a separate code for that for school safety. Okay. So in other places, I'll include examples. But that just kind of gives you a sense of how specific you want your code book to be. Okay. So I will just hang around if anyone has other questions. I hope that kind of walking through was helpful. Someone mentioned that actually conducting a demonstration would be useful, and I do agree. But if you're interested in using AtlasTi, I personally use, I don't have it on my computer, but I use the remote lab through the library. There's really careful instructions. Let's see if I can pull it up quickly. I have it bookmarked. So I'll drop the link in the chat. So there are a whole host of specialized software that's usually available through the research studio in the library that you can use remotely, including AtlasTi.